Section 5, Creating a First-Person Shooter Game. So in Section 5, we are finally going to get around to creating a 3D type game in Unity. So we have 6 different videos to go through in here. So our first video is the first-person view with shooting. Second is adding enemies and implementing navigation meshes. Third is simple state machine and utilizing a sphere overlap. Then next is a player health bar, enemy health bars, and death. Next is a time limit, and then lastly are the animations. So in our first video, we're going to be going over first-person view with some shooting. So in this video, we are going to cover creating a 3D scene, player movement, first-person camera view, and then shooting bullets in 3D. Creating a 3D scene can be quite different from a 2D scene. You should also be careful on the amount of polygons that each game object possesses in your scene, because this can actually cause a lot of stress on your computer's memory. So for this example, we're just going to use a couple of 3D objects, which will include the revolver, as well as also the enemies themselves. Here we will create a basic capsule object to serve as our player. We will move the camera and to be a part of the object itself, so it's going to be a child object. Then we will have a true first-person view. We will script the player movement and then take a look at the character controller component, which we will need in order to have physics colliding with our player and also to have a bit more of sort of more humanoid-like movement. Then we can also see how to fire bullets from our gun. So let's head over to Unity, and I am getting started right now with my 3D project. Make sure that your 3D selection is checked, and I just named mine drone shooter. So let's get our scene created, and now our scene has opened up. Okay, so I have a couple of packs right here that I also downloaded off of the asset store. So this here is the revolver for our player, so let me just import that. And I also have some tile textures for our scene, and I'm going to import the folder. And right now we have 2 different folders right here. So we have the gun and we also have the tile textures. Okay, so let's go ahead now and let's create our scene. So what I'm going to do is start off by making a plane. And this here is going to serve as our ground that the player is going to walk across. So I'm going to apply a texture to this. I'm going to apply the tile texture. And there we go. So I'm just going to leave this here as plain, but I'm going to create a couple of child objects to it in a second. Actually, I'm going to just expand this a bit more to get it to stretch a bit more across the scene. And let me just open up the inspector here and see what the measurements are. Actually, I think 1 will be okay. You have to also be careful on how many polygons your scene is actually rendering. And you can actually check that here in the stats as well. You can actually see like the toll that it might take on your CPU. You can also see a lot of different stuff here, like the frames per second here. So you can actually test and see how much stress on your computer. So let's also make a couple of cubes here. Let's just try to keep everything normal size here so we don't have too much going on in our scene, so our computers can actually not take such a pounding. So I'm going to stretch out this cube a bit to create a couple of walls. And I'm just going to change the transform of this one to about 0.44, 2.21, and then 5.19. Okay. And now I'm going to just rotate this. Okay, there we go. So that's a bit more easier to do. And now I'm going to set up this wall at about, let me maneuver my scene over here. Okay, and I'm going to just set this wall up right over here. So this is going to be around where the player starts, is going to be right over here. So we're going to have a bit of a maze going on here. Now I'm going to duplicate this, and now we're going to set up our next cube, or our next wall. We're going to set the scale to about, let's set the Z here to about 9.6. So we have a slightly bigger one, and we just need to rotate this, and this is going to be our far wall, right down this way. And we're just going to set that up right over here. It's a little bit off. Let me check the rotation. All right, let's set it to about 89.68. No, that's a little bit too much. Let me just rotate that back around. All right, let me just set that over here and just pull it back a bit. Okay, so the rotation for that one should be about 1.15, and on the x-axis to be about negative 0.3, and then on the z should be about negative 0.4, and that should be fine. So let me go on now and create the next one. And I'm going to just move this right back here. Move this up a bit. Okay. Maybe just a bit down. Okay. And now what we have to do is create our two side walls. So let's pull this one out. And let's give it a size, scale of 0.44. 2 point. Okay, so this should be pretty fine. Actually, I think that we could just go ahead and just rotate this around. And then let's just move this to the back. And push it up a bit more. Okay, and then just duplicate that and then just bring it to the other side. Okay, so we have our maze set up. We just need one more cube. And it's going to go right over here. So just duplicate that one. And now what we have to do is just scale this one a bit down more. And push this back a bit more. Let me just zoom in and see how this looks. Okay. Push that back against the wall. Okay. So this is how our scene should be looking right now. Let me just rotate this one here a bit more. And I'll also just move this back. Okay, so we should have a pretty good scene going on right here. Let me just apply a brick texture to this. To all of them. Oh, let me just apply this brick texture over here. No. Alright, so I'll just apply it manually. So now this way here we have some actual walls and not just some plain white cubes. Okay, great. So now our walls are all set up. So what we need to do right now is create our player. So what we are going to do is just collapse that, save your scene, and we can just call this scene 1. Now let's create our player object. So as I said before, we're going to be using a capsule object, and we're just going to call this one here player. So let's maneuver this and scale it down a bit because it is quite large. And we want our player to start right over here. This is going to be like the starting point for our player. Let's move him back over here. And let us scale our player to be about 0.27, 0.26, and then on the Z, 0.28. So now our player is a bit more smaller, and it kind of fits in the scene a bit more. Just want to pull that up a bit more. Okay, great. So now next what we have to do in order to get our game to be truly first person is we have to take the camera object and we're going to make it a child of the player. Now what we have to do is just maneuver the camera to be right on top of the player. So actually what you can do here is just take the player's position and just copy it over into the camera. Okay, so we're actually pretty close up here, and let me just grab a hold of the camera again, move it over here, and just so we can see where we are, let's turn the camera, and we should be behind the player right now. Okay, so let's move it up. There we go. And now let's move the camera just a bit more up so it's actually like we are in the head zone of the player. If you want to, you can actually try to get more in back of the player themselves, like so. And then you can actually get a much better view of how this might be situated. So right here is where we are, basically right on top of the player, and you're basically just looking straight out. So what we are going to do right now is we're going to take our gun and put the gun in the scene. So let's go over here and grab the prefab and just drag and drop that into the scene. It's going to be really big, probably. So we're going to have to edit this a bit. So move this up, and let's just type in a new scale for it. So the scale for this gun, and we could just rename this here as gun, is going to be negative 0.015, 0.012, and then 0.0069. Okay. And then just rotate that up. Still might be too big, but we will see. Okay, so drag that over and put it to where our player is. There we go. Alright, so our gun is kind of large. We can actually scale it down a bit more, but you also want to make sure that still looks pretty good in the camera view, right over here in the game view. There we go. Okay, so let's just move that back a bit more. Okay, so this should actually be about what our gun, about like where our gun should be at. I think it's actually kind of falling through the floor right now. Scale it down a bit more. Back to there. Try to get much more onto the player. Okay, there. So now it actually looks like the player is actually kind of holding the gun. Get out there into the scene view. Okay, good. Okay, so that looks a bit more realistic. So you can lower the gun, you can just basically move it however you want. I'm perfectly happy with this. One last thing is I actually have this green material that I created for our player, so I'm just going to drag and drop that onto the player to give him some color. Okay, so just make sure that you have the gun as a child object of the player, and now we should be ready to start doing some coding. So what we are going to do first is make our scripts folder. Okay, let's make our C# script then. And then we'll make our scripts folder. So since we are probably going to have a bit more scripts than usual for this project, we are going to try to come up with some subfolders to store our scripts into. So let's create another folder within our scripts folder, and we're going to call this one here player scripts. And you can just drag and drop your C# script into there. So let's name this one here player controller. And when ready, just to be sure to attach this to your player. You can just drag and drop it on. And for some reason it's saying that the script cannot be found. I'm not sure why. Alright, so just go over to your player and hit add component and then type in player controller. And we'll just add this as a new script because for some reason it wasn't working when I was trying to drag it on. And then what we'll do is we'll just drag and drop this into the scripts folder. And then we'll just drag this into the player scripts. Okay, great. So let's open up our script for editing. And now we should be ready to code. Okay, great. So first off, inside of the player controller, we are going to need to define a couple of variables in order to get our player to move. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to define a couple of variables. So going to define a private float speed equals 6.f. Then we're going to define private float gravity equals 20.0f. Then private float rotation speed, or rot speed, which will equal about 90.0f. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of our start method for right now. And we're going to go into our update function, and we're going to first call a player movement. But right now we don't have player movement defined, but that's perfectly okay. We're going to do it right now. So void player movement. All right, so as of right now, we are going to use something called a character controller on our player game object. For this, our script is going to need to gain reference to that. So let's head over to our Unity editor, click on our player, and we're going to have to add the component of character controller. So the reason why we need the character controller is because this will actually take into account the physics collisions with our other game objects here, such as our walls and our floor. So we are actually going into our script, and we're going to be gaining reference to a couple of input settings in here, such as along the axes, as the horizontal as well as the vertical axes, and we're going to be moving our player in those directions. The issue with that is it will actually ignore all physics collisions, so we actually need this to have a character controller attached to it. So in player movement, what we are going to do is we're going to define a transform.rotate, and we're going to pass in a couple of parameters here. 0, then input.getAxis, and then type in the string horizontal times rot speed time.delta time, and then 0. And just make sure that you close off. So now in here, what we are going to do next is we're going to gain reference to our character controller. Controller equals game object dot get component character controller, and then we're going to set up a conditional underneath. And in this if statement, we're going to gain reference to the character controller, and we're going to say controller dot is grounded. So what this is going to do is test if the player is currently colliding with the plane, and if they are currently on the ground. So if they are, then we're going to move them forward and basically apply some sort of force to make them go forward. So we're going to put a move direction, and move direction is basically a part of the character controller, and we're going to pass in a vector 3.forward multiplied by input.getAxis vertical, then move direction equals transform.transform direction, move direction, then move direction, and then increment that by speed, then move direction, dot y, and now we're going to move it basically along the y-axis going forward. We're going to decrement that by gravity times time dot delta time, and then controller dot move direction times time dot delta time. Let me build that out real quick, and we have a couple of errors right now. And actually the reason why was because I just provided the private variable of vector 3 for the move direction, so it actually was not defined this entire time. And then vector 3.0. Okay, so we're originally setting the move direction to 0 here, and then we're basically setting it equal to a vector 3 to move it forward in the vertical direction. And then basically, let me just build this out. Change that to multiplication, actually. And now it builds out correctly. Okay, so basically we're taking the vector 3 of move direction, and we're having it start at 0, then we are basically taking the move direction here and setting it equal to a vector 3 of going forward in relation to the vertical axis. Then the move direction will equal to the transform of the direction in the move direction, whatever the move direction is. So basically the transform direction is part of the character controller to move it forward. Then we are basically moving it at a certain speed. Then the move direction of the Y value here will basically go against gravity over time, basically being decremented. And then we're moving the controller here of the actual player controller from the move direction multiplied by time.delta time. So let's head back to our script right now, to our scene view. What we're going to do is just click on the player here, and let's see if we can actually move along our scene. Okay, so now if you can see, if we hit the walls, then we are actually met with some resistance. And then we actually cannot move forward. Alright, so just a couple of things to make a quick note. So you may have actually noticed that my character was actually going off in the wrong direction when I hit forward. That's because I actually had him rotated wrong in the scene view. So actually right now, as you could tell, when I collide with a wall, I'm actually not going through it. It's actually preventing me from moving forward. So yeah, like you do actually go through the wall a little bit. That's because of the camera view actually. So if we just move the camera back a bit, we should actually be okay. But you can always reduce the camera. Yeah, see? So now like you still go through the wall a little bit, but you actually are getting resistance from the wall as well. So yeah, like this is okay for now. But you can always just move the camera back if you don't really like this, or you can just adjust the size of the camera as well. So pretty much the rotation that I set this at is now at, for the player, at about 91.43 if you were following along here on the y-axis. And also for the main camera, I also changed up the rotations as well, and also for the gun. So this is pretty much what we are looking for right now with the player controller, as well as the different physics going on here. So as I said before, you can just run up to the walls and you won't go through them. Another thing too is if you were following along and if you have a different input than me, I actually set the horizontal and the vertical buttons to different settings here. I actually have the up for the vertical, I have the positive button going set to hotkey to W. I also have the negative button hotkeyed as S. For the horizontal, which is basically the rotation, I have the negative button set as A and the positive button set to D. Okay, so what we are going to do right now is define a shooting script for our gun. So it's kind of similar to what we have been doing before with shooting. So what we're going to define right now is a shoot controller, and add that. And now let's open up the script for editing. So first, right off, what we're going to do is create a serialized field, and we're going to create a private game object called bullet. Then we are also going to create another serialized field, another private transform of the spawn area like we have done before. And now, right before we actually start going into our start method, let's define a timer. And what the timer is going to do is it's basically going to create a sort of time limit that you can spawn the bullets in. So we're not actually just spamming bullets all the time. So let's go into the start method here, and we're going to instantiate the timer here. We're going to increment the timer here by 1. And then we're going to define a new method here called spawn bullet. So let's get rid of our update function, and now we're going to create void spawn bullet. In our spawn bullet method, we're going to create a conditional input dot get mouse button down, and we're going to take basically the left key of the mouse button, and if the timer is greater than or equal to 20, then we're going to go in here and do game object bullet clone equals instantiate bullet spawn area dot position spawn area dot rotation. And now what we're going to do is get the bullet clone dot get component rigid body. We just need the rigid body, the regular rigid body this time. Add force spawn area dot transform dot up times 900, and we'll put actually about 800. We could put the force as. Set the timer to 0 to restart it, and then we're going to destroy the bullet clone after about 0.5 seconds. So pretty much what we're doing here is we're actually going to take the transform of the spawn area this time, and we're going to instantiate right at the tip of the gun, basically where the spawn area is, and then applying some force to it. So let's go in now, let's create our new bullet prefab, and let's just create another folder here called prefabs. Open that up. Let's go in here and let's just create another 3D sphere object, and let's really make this small. So we kind of want to be able to see our bullet object a bit, so we don't want to make this too small. So yeah, it's kind of like a BB, from a BB gun in a sense. Let's make that a bit more smaller. That's a little bit too small. Okay, so that's not such a bad size. So we'll just rename this one here bullet. And what we will do now is just drag and drop that into the prefabs folder. And we could just delete that from the scene. In here, put a rigid body on it. And it already has a collider, which is one of the really good things about using 3D game development. So now let's go over to our gun. And let's drag our bullet prefab in here, and now we just need to define our spawn area. So let's create an empty game object, and we'll just call this one here spawn, and we'll just move it here to the front part of our gun. Alright, so we might actually have to rotate this around a bit, but we'll see how the bullets are being instantiated. And let's test it out. Alright, so actually if we go back into our script, I actually put it into a start method. I actually meant to put it into an update method instead. So right now just change your start to update and it should actually work. Okay, so as you can tell, the bullet is actually kind of spawning out of the handle of the gun. But our timer is still going, and our timer actually resets, so we actually have a bit more of a, not so much of a crazy spawn rate here with the bullets. So let's just move our spawn a bit more up, a little bit more to the side maybe, so we can try to get it coming right from the nozzle. Okay, so this actually looks pretty good. So what we have, it's not exactly too straight, but yeah, it could work. So right now the timer is actually putting a bit more of a cap on our bullet spawn rate while our bullets are still being spawned in the 3D zone. Alright, great. So you have actually learned how to take player movement in the 3D space using the character controller, and you also have learned now how to actually instantiate the bullets. So just a quick note here with the player movement again, we are actually also taking the rotation here of the horizontal area here, and this is actually what we're multiplying it by with the horizontal time. I may have actually made a mistake with that before, but the rotation speed here is basically used to pivot the player along the horizontal axis, while the vertical one is basically to move backwards or forward.